Yes, Lake, I'll be sure to make that a strong point here. Yeah. Okay, well look, I will see you, what, Sunday? Okay, cheers. Oh, hi, David Vizard here. You guys are watching PowerTech 10. Now, what's on the agenda for this edition of PowerTech 10? That's 155. Well, here I teamed up with Lake Speed. I was just on the phone to him there. He wanted to be sure that I emphasized a certain point, which I'm glad he reminded me. I can be a little forgetful at times. Anyway, the purpose of this video, twofold. One was to see how good or bad Breakin oil was from the factory. Test vehicle, my 2.3 turbo EcoBoost Mustang. The second thing is whether or not to flush between fill-ups. That is, you drain out the old oil, flush it through with clean oil. Any oil will do, just cheap oil. Just run the engine for 10 minutes at a fast idle, drain that, then put the real oil in. Oh, change oil to the flushing oil and a filter. Any cheap old filter will do. Right, we're only going to run it for 10 or 20 minutes. And then put in the real oil. And the test will be to see how dirty the Breakin oil was compared with the flushing oil. Right? Is flushing it a waste of time? Or does most of the debris come out when you just change your oil? Let's see what happens here. What am I doing in this episode? I'm doing an oil change with the emphasis on oil analysis and what it is in terms of how I believe it should be done when you're doing an oil analysis or getting the cleanest engine possible. So here we go. Well, the first thing to do is warm up the engine. Hopefully you can hear what I'm saying okay. The engine doesn't make a lot of noise, but there again, nor do I, so I've got to compensate for what little noise that makes. When I say warm the engine up, personally I like to get the engine up to at least 170 degrees and leave it run for a while. The reason for that is, if the car's been standing, even only for a couple of days, all the contaminants, or 95% of them, drop to the bottom of the tank. So you really need a good oil circulation. Now, flip on the throttle once in a while to stir all that up. So, let's go and do a throttle check. Now it should go without saying that you don't run the engine with the garage door closed. Mine's wide open and I've got one of those big 2.5 by 2.5 feet fans blowing air in on full power. The back of the car is hanging just outside the back of the garage door, so really it's dumping it out there and I'm pulling in fresh air from over on this side of the garage. So I can feel the drop on here. It's coming in here, around here. Most of it's going back out there. Now let me explain a little more about this oil change. I'm doing this oil change so that it conforms to Lake Speed's method of doing an oil change and getting, at the next oil change, a pure reading of the oil as possible, i.e. not contaminating the previous oil change. Let me show you what I've got to do it all here. Here we've got 3 4-quart cans of the oil that we're eventually going to use. Here in the black containers, I've got 8 quarts of oil that I'm going to use to flush it through. What I will do is drain the oil in there, remove the filter, then take that cheap filter that I've got, and I will put approximately approximately 6 quarts of that oil in. I will then run it for a while, drain it, and then pour these 2 quarts in and drain that. So that will be a running flush, that will be a stationary flush. When I come around to filling up with the real thing, the engine will take almost 2 of these, but beforehand I will flush it with one of these. So that's the process. Now this oil is hot, so I gotta watch my hands here. Try and undo the nut always from above. Here we go. It's going to come gushing out. Now I'm going to let go of this. Here it is pretty black, which is just what I expected. So this is what we're looking to test to see actually how dirty it is compared with its color. Do they kind of, let's say, go hand in hand? We'll see when we get to the test. Well, that's done. 3.5 hours that's taken. 3.5 hours to do about an hour's work. Getting underneath that car and back out again. A couple of times I had to wait until somebody came along to be able to pick me up, so I couldn't get off the floor. Hey, got the job done. That's the thing. The original factory oil, the Breakin oil that is, as used by Ford, is on the left. Our flushing oil is on the right. Bear in mind we've got 2,500 miles on the left-hand oil and 20 minutes running at idle and relatively low RPM blips on the right. You will have to look very closely to see that the oil on the right is slightly lighter. And those 2 blue objects behind the jars here, they are high lumen LED lights. Notice they do not shine through the oil to any noticeable degree. The fine difference that we saw between the Breakin oil and the flushing oil carried over to the filters. Here's the filter that was originally fitted by Ford. There was almost no particles in it. I have never seen an oil filter with so few particles at Breakin. So the suspicion that this engine may have had a provisional rebuild, maybe not stripped down all the way, but maybe say a cam was out or something like that. But they would have had to have drained the oil and put new oil in. So our Breakin oil, we should assume, is not representative of what would normally be seen. However, it will not affect our test here because we are testing the before and after for a flush. At this point, let's take a look at the results that Lake Speed delivered and see what the picture is when we start measuring particles instead of just looking at it. We can see from looking at it that the oil colors up really quickly when it's just dropped in an engine that's just going to be flushed out. So how many particles were there in that flushed oil? How much would we have contaminated the new oil that we're putting in? Let's say we're changing from an ordinary oil to a really good synthetic. We don't want to dilute the effects of that synthetic, especially as it often costs a lot more. Anyway, Lake Speed's results coming up. Now I'm not going to go into detail on pages 2 and 3. What we're most interested in is the results on page 1. So let's start there. Here I'm going to home in on the initial data, which is what your oil is, what the sample is, etc., your identification, and so on. Moving down the page, we get to some stuff which is probably more meaningful in terms of a test. We see what the viscosity is at this 2500 mile interval, oxidization value, fuel dilution, etc. Notice all those are checked OK. Negative on the water and glycol means there was none. Moving on to the additive package, we see that this oil was well stocked with calcium, sodium was minimal, magnesium, etc. A goodly amount of zinc there, also molybdenum and boron. In a moment we'll make a comparison between that and the flushing oil. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Here we have the impurification contents of the oil. Now I need to say something here. These numbers are exceptionally low. In fact, they are outlying from the main group that you would expect. So something has gone on with this engine that has not been in the normal run of things. For instance, I suspect, and this is only a suspicion, that this engine originally failed its dyno test at the factory and was torn down, rebuilt with the floor fixed and put back together. So it was partially broken in. Now, most of the debris from a break-in happens in the first few minutes, literally. So let's say it had done 10 minutes running and it was below par. And they rebuilt the engine, cleaned it all up, put whatever was wrong with it right, and then put it back together. This kind of deal would account for its very low contaminants. Now, that isn't going to affect our test because we are going to see what the difference is between the contamination of this oil and the contamination of the flushing oil. So let's take a look at the flushing oil. This column here is the factory fill break-in oil. And this column is the O'Reilly oil that I used for flushing. Not that it matters for the tests we're doing here, but note that both were 5W30. On to the oil health section. Now you can find out what the significance of all these chemicals are on page 2 and 3, but let me quickly go through here. First off, viscosity. Both oils are right in the middle of where they should be. The oxidization value was low for both oils. This is what we would expect for the new O'Reilly oil. However, an almost identical figure, 7.9, of the factory oil indicates that their claim that it will go 5,000 miles is fairly well substantiated here. Now, I'm not going to go through all the other oil additives here. Suffice to say that all the effects of each of these has on the oil is on pages 2 and 3. However, I do want to point out the much increased amount of zinc in the factory break-in oil. That is what you would expect for a break-in oil. On to the next section, equipment health. Now this is where we really get down to the nitty-gritty. The column you need to give the most attention is the one arrowed. This is the O'Reilly flushing oil. The point to note here is that it contains quite a few particles of contaminant. The first thing to note is that it has the same amount of particles of iron as the oil drained after break-in, which means that at least half of the break-in particles were left on the floor of the pan. So we should be able to justify flushing just from that alone. But the real point to note here is the total metals. You'll notice that the oil we flushed through is almost as dirty as the oil that we drained initially. Well, that last column and last line that we looked at there seem to indicate that flushing the engine after you've drained the initial oil is the thing to do, because there's a lot of particles left in there. Now, I'm having to do this because I could be changing different types of oil and different blends and all that as time goes by. I will be changing the oil on this and taking readings for it for this Project Mustang, probably about every 2,500 miles, mostly of which are be slow driven street miles to the racetrack and back. Then maybe in that 2,500 miles there will be 25 to 30 passes of the drag strip. So that will be the range over which it's driven. Now, there is something I want to add to this. I'm sure a lot of you are saying, oh my God, have I got to add a whole oil change to the cost of my oil change? Not necessarily. Let's say you don't flush the oil, but you can change the oil consistently in as much as you warm the motor up to the same temperature and you put it at the same angle on the jacks so that it's maybe slight down slope to the where the oil comes out, the oil drain, etc., etc., and you're uniform on that. Here's the thing: when you put the new oil in, you'll dilute all those contaminants, and then when you check it next time, what you do is you do exactly the same procedure, drain all those contaminants out, put the new oil in, and what happens is you'll be running what we call a running average, right? So by the time you've done that 3 or 4 times, or done an oil change 3 or 4 times, the oil change will be almost representative of what's going on, because you'll see the difference between one and the next one. So here's my thoughts on this, and I'd like Lake Speed to chime in on one of his videos to see if he agrees with this, because like I've said, yeah, sure, I know quite a bit about oils, but when I don't know something, Lake is the guy I turn to. I clamp down on a guy for saying, well, Lake Speed knows a lot more about it than you do. Well, yeah, that's the guy I refer to. Now, what I want Lake to do is give his opinion of whether or not flushing, or the value of flushing compared with the value of doing a straight drain. What I'm saying is if you're doing a very serious oil analysis like I'm doing, and changing oils and things like this, a flush is kind of essential to get the picture. If you've already settled on a good oil and you're checking to see if your engine is fine at each oil change, so long as you repeat the oil change in exactly the same fashion, i.e. the car jacked up with a bit of a downslope or forward slope, whichever the pan requires, and temperature is the same when you drain the oil, you let so much out and collect your sample, and you're consistent, then the oil sample will show the change in your engine state of health. So if you know at the first one it was good, regardless of what that was, it would be the change of that at the next oil change that would show whether or not it's good. So Lake, chime in on that to make sure that you are up to speed on what I'm saying, but that's what I've got here. Research stuff, got to flush it. Road stuff, consistent oil, maybe not. So that's the what I've got to say on flush or no flush. Well, here we are, 2 bottles. This one is the oil from the flush that I did. This one is the Breakin oil, which has 25,000 miles on it. Now you might think that's a long time, but Ford say you can run the oil that you buy the car with for up to 5,000 miles. So I've done just half the mileage they recommended was okay. Now, let's talk about young Lake Speed's oil analysis deal. You know, it comes very nicely packaged. Here's the bare bottle, but what I really like about it is it comes with a box to send it back. All you got to do is go to the post office and it's done. So I am going to pack just these 2 bottles in here because that's all I've used so far, and take it down to the post office. Be a few days before I get the results, but we can see what the results are from the technique that I use to do an oil change. Now, if you watch Lake's program, he will tell you to flush with a certain amount of oil that you're going to use. Well, that may be the ultimate way of doing it, but the oil I'm using is darnably expensive stuff. So I just flushed with good old-fashioned cheap Walmart oil. It's only going to be in there for 20 minutes, and it's only ever going to run at idle, just enough to clean it all up. Well, clean up a lot of what's in there. So that's the what I've got to say on flush or no flush. Right, so thank you for bearing with me through all this, and thank you for watching. Don't forget, subscribe, share, like, get notified, and there's that special super thanks button, right? We got race cars to run here that we're doing research on. It costs money, so everything's a help. Thank you for watching.